It was a chilly autumn afternoon when Officer Jake Reynolds stepped into Rosie's Café, the small diner he visited every day on his break. The warm scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries filled the air. The place was busy but calm, with regular customers chatting softly and the occasional clatter of plates from the kitchen. Jake, a seasoned officer in his late 30s, was well known in town. He was friendly but observant, always keeping an eye on his surroundings. As he ordered his usual black coffee, he noticed an elderly woman sitting alone by the window. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and she wore a light blue sweater that looked slightly worn but well cared for. Jake had seen her before. Margaret was a longtime resident, known for her kindness and gentle nature. But today, something was different. She wasn't reading her book like she usually did. Instead, she seemed restless, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as she stole nervous glances toward the parking lot. As Jake picked up his coffee, he felt a presence beside him. He turned and found Margaret standing there, her wrinkled hands shaking slightly. "Officer Reynolds," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jake frowned, immediately sensing something was wrong. He leaned in slightly. "Yes, Mom. Is everything okay?" Margaret swallowed hard, her eyes filled with worry. She hesitated, looking around as if afraid someone might hear her. Then, in a voice so soft he almost didn't catch it, she said, "There's a man in the parking lot. He has a gun, and he's watching you." A chill ran down Jake's spine. He kept his expression calm, not wanting to alarm the other customers. His years of training taught him how to handle dangerous situations, but he also knew that panicking wouldn't help. Slowly, without turning his head too quickly, Jake glanced toward the large window facing the parking lot. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just a few parked cars and people walking by. But then his sharp eyes locked onto a dark sedan parked at the far end of the lot. Inside, behind the wheel, sat a man wearing a black hoodie pulled low over his face. His posture was tense, and though his hands were not clearly visible, Jake could feel the weight of his stare. The man wasn't looking at the cafe in general. He was watching Jake specifically. Jake's heart rate picked up, but his face remained neutral. He turned back to Margaret and gave her a small nod. "Thank you for telling me," he said in a calm voice. "I need you to go back to your table and act like everything is normal. Can you do that for me?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Please be careful," she whispered before shuffling back to her seat. Jake reached for his radio, keeping his movements slow and controlled. He pressed the button and spoke in a low voice. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. I need backup at Rosie's Café. Possible armed suspect in the parking lot. Suspect is in a black sedan. Driver's seat, watching the cafe." As he waited for a response, Jake kept one hand close to his holster. His body was relaxed, but his mind was racing through different scenarios. If the man was armed, he had to be careful about how he approached. He couldn't risk endangering the people inside the cafe. The radio crackled. "Copy that, Reynolds. Backup is on the way. Hold tight." Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, keeping his eyes trained on the reflection in the cafe window. The man in the car hadn't moved, but something about the way he sat there, waiting, sent a shiver down Jake's spine. Who was he? And why was he watching? Jake was about to find out. Jake Reynolds sat still, his fingers lightly wrapped around his coffee cup. He kept his face calm, but his mind was alert. The man in the black sedan hadn't moved. He was still sitting there, watching. Margaret sat back at her table, her hands clasped together. She glanced at Jake once, worry clear in her eyes. He gave her a slight nod, letting her know that he was handling it. The cafe was filled with quiet conversations, the clinking of silverware against plates, and the occasional sound of the coffee machine hissing. Nobody else had noticed anything unusual. Jake wanted to keep it that way. The last thing he needed was for people to panic. His radio crackled. "Reynolds, this is dispatch. 2 units are 2 minutes away. Hold your position." 2 minutes. That wasn't long, But in a tense situation like this, it felt like forever. Jake took another slow sip of his coffee, using the reflection in the window to keep an eye on the sit-in. The man still wasn't moving. Was he waiting for something or someone? Then something changed. The man in the sit-in turned his head slightly. He wasn't looking at Jake anymore. He was looking at Margaret. Jake's grip on his cup tightened. Was she the real target? He stood up, moving casually toward Margaret's table. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" he asked, keeping his voice light. Margaret nodded quickly. "Please," she whispered. Jake sat across from her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Do you know him?" Margaret hesitated. Her hands trembled as she reached for her cup of tea. She wrapped her fingers around it as if trying to steady herself. Finally, she whispered, "Yes, he's my grandson." Jake's stomach tightened. Her grandson. That changed everything. "His name is Daniel," she continued, her voice shaky. "He's not a bad boy, Officer Reynolds. He's just lost." Jake kept his expression neutral. "Does he have a weapon?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, I saw it in his lap when I walked past his car. That's why I told you." Jake exhaled softly. "Why is he here?" Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "I don't know, but I think he's in trouble." Jake had handled plenty of difficult situations before, but this was different. If Daniel really was dangerous, he needed to be stopped. But if there was a chance to calm him down peacefully, Jake wanted to take it. Outside, the sound of sirens in the distance made Jake's heart beat faster. Backup was almost here. He had to act fast. "Margaret, listen to me," he said gently. "I need you to stay inside, no matter what happens. Do not go outside, okay?" Margaret wiped her eyes and nodded. "Please, don't hurt him," she whispered. "I'll do my best," Jake assured her. Then, he stood up and walked toward the door. The moment he stepped outside, the air felt colder. The black sedan was still parked in the same spot. The man inside, Daniel, was gripping the steering wheel tightly. Jake took a deep breath and walked toward the car. His hands relaxed at his sides, showing no threat. He kept his voice calm but firm. "Daniel," he called out, "my name is Officer Reynolds. I just want to talk." Daniel flinched, his shoulders tensing. He didn't open the door. He didn't roll down the window. He just sat there, gripping the wheel. Jake took another step closer. The sirens grew louder. Backup was almost there. But then, Daniel's hand moved, and Jake saw the gun. The situation was about to take a dangerous turn. Jake Reynolds didn't move too fast. One wrong step, and this could turn deadly. The gun was in Daniel's lap. It wasn't raised yet, but it was there. Jake's pulse quickened, but his face stayed calm. The sirens were close now. Backup would arrive any second. Jake knew that if Daniel panicked, things could go bad quickly. He had to keep him calm. "Daniel," Jake said again, his voice steady. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk." Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. His knuckles were white. He still didn't look at Jake. He stared straight ahead, breathing heavily. Jake slowly raised his hands, showing he wasn't a threat. "Your grandmother is worried about you," he said. "She's inside the cafe." At the mention of his grandmother, Daniel twitched. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Jake took a small step closer. "She told me you're not a bad person. She thinks you're in trouble." Daniel let out a shaky breath. His hands trembled. "I didn't want to come here," he muttered, barely loud enough for Jake to hear. "I don't know what to do." Jake's heart ached at the fear in the young man's voice. He looked about 25, maybe younger. His hoodie was worn, and his face was pale. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. "You don't have to do anything right now," Jake said softly. "Just talk to me." Daniel finally turned his head. His eyes were red, filled with pain and uncertainty. "I messed up," he whispered. I messed up bad. Jake nodded slowly. I hear you, but this isn't the way to fix it. He glanced at the gun. You're scared, and I get that. But if you make the wrong move, it'll only make things worse. The sirens suddenly stopped. The backup officers had arrived. Jake didn't turn to look, but he knew they were taking their positions. They would be ready to act if Daniel made a wrong move. Daniel's breathing quickened. He gripped the gun but didn't raise it. Daniel, Jake said firmly, his voice low but serious. I need you to listen to me. Keep your hands where I can see them. Let's talk this through. Nobody has to get hurt. Daniel's eyes darted around. He was scared. Maybe he was thinking about running. Maybe he was thinking about doing something worse. Jake felt the tension in the air. Every second mattered. Please, Jake said. Your grandmother is inside. She doesn't want to lose you. Daniel's lip trembled. He swallowed hard. Then, he moved his hand. Jake's muscles tensed, ready to react. But Daniel didn't grab the gun. Instead, he pushed it to the side, away from himself. His shoulders sagged, and his head dropped. I don't know what to do, he said again, his voice breaking. Relief flooded through Jake, but he stayed cautious. Okay, he said gently. Let's figure it out together. He signaled to the backup officers, letting them know the situation was under control. One of them approached carefully, retrieving the gun from the passenger seat. Another opened the car door. Daniel didn't resist as they pulled him out of the car. He looked lost, broken. As they secured him, Margaret rushed out of the cafe. Daniel, she cried, tears streaming down her face. Jake turned to her. He's safe, he assured her. It's going to be okay. Margaret clutched her chest, sobbing with relief. Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with guilt. I'm sorry, Grandma, he whispered. Margaret reached out, gently touching his face. We'll get through this, she said. I promise. For the first time, Daniel let out a deep, shaky breath. Maybe, just maybe, things could still be fixed. Daniel stood by the car, his hands cuffed behind his back. His head hung low, and his body trembled. The officers beside him stayed alert, watching his every move. Though he hadn't fought back, they still had to be careful. Margaret took a step forward, her hands shaking. Her eyes were filled with concern, not fear. Daniel, why are you here? She asked softly. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked away, his jaw tight. Jake stepped closer, speaking in a calm voice. Daniel, we need to understand what's going on. We can't help you unless you tell us the truth. Daniel clenched his fists. He let out a heavy breath before finally speaking. I didn't mean to scare anyone, he muttered. I didn't know where else to go. Margaret's eyes welled with tears. Then why bring a gun, sweetheart? She whispered. Daniel flinched. He looked at her, shame written all over his face. I wasn't going to use it, I swear. He stopped, his voice breaking. Jake studied him carefully. The young man was clearly on edge, but he wasn't acting like someone who wanted to hurt others. He looked more like someone running from something. Daniel, Jake said gently, are you in trouble? Daniel hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yes, he admitted. Big trouble. Jake exchanged a glance with his fellow officers. This wasn't just about a young man with a gun. Something bigger was going on. Margaret reached out, placing a wrinkled hand on Daniel's arm. Tell us, dear. Please. Daniel swallowed hard. His eyes darted around, as if checking to see who was watching. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, They're looking for me. Jake frowned. Who? Daniel's breath hitched. He lowered his voice. Some guys I worked for. I made a mistake. I took something I shouldn't have. The officers tensed. Jake's instincts told him this was about more than just a bad decision. What did you take? He asked carefully. Daniel looked down at the ground. Money, he admitted. A lot of it. Margaret gasped. Oh, Daniel. Jake's mind raced. If Daniel had stolen from dangerous people, then it wasn't just him who was at risk. Margaret could be in danger too. How much are we talking about? Jake pressed. Daniel hesitated before answering. $20,000. Jake let out a slow breath. That was enough money to make dangerous criminals very angry. When did you take it? Jake asked. Daniel's fingers twitched. 3 days ago. They found out yesterday. I've been hiding since then. Jake's gut tightened. If these men were looking for Daniel, they wouldn't stop until they found him. And if they knew about Margaret, they might go after her too. Jake turned to the other officers. We need to get Daniel and his grandmother somewhere safe. Now. Margaret's eyes widened. You think they'll come here? Jake nodded. If they know he's in town, it's possible. Daniel bit his lip. I didn't mean to bring trouble here, he said. He broke off, his eyes full of regret. Jake put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Right now, we need to focus on keeping you both safe. Just as he spoke, something caught his eye. A black SUV had pulled into the parking lot. Jake's body tensed. He recognized the type of vehicle immediately. Tinted windows, slow movements, sitting just far enough away to watch without drawing too much attention. Margaret followed Jake's gaze. Her face paled. Is that them? She whispered. Daniel's whole body went rigid. Yes, he said, his voice barely audible. The situation had just gotten a lot worse. Jake's entire body went on high alert as he watched the black SUV roll to a slow stop at the far end of the parking lot. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. But Jake didn't need to see their faces. He already knew they weren't here by accident. Daniel's breathing quickened. He took a step back, his eyes filled with fear. It's them, he whispered again. They found me. Margaret clutched Jake's arm, her fingers trembling. Oh dear Lord. Jake acted fast. He turned to his fellow officers. Get them inside. Now. One officer quickly guided Margaret and Daniel toward the cafe, moving them behind cover. Another stayed close, hand on his holster, ready for anything. Jake himself stayed in place, watching the SUV closely. For a few tense seconds, nothing happened. The SUV just sat there, engine running. Then, the driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out. He was dressed in dark jeans and a leather jacket. His hair was slicked back, and even from a distance, Jake could see the sharpness in his eyes. He wasn't afraid. He was confident, too confident. Another man got out from the passenger side, then a third from the back. All of them moved slowly, deliberately, like they had all the time in the world. Jake's grip tightened around his belt. He took a single step forward, standing between them and the cafe. That's far enough, he called out firmly. The leader of the group smirked. He put his hands in his pockets and tilted his head. Afternoon, officer, he said smoothly. Nice day, huh? Jake didn't blink. State your business. The man chuckled. Come on now. No need to be so tense. We're just here to see a friend. Jake didn't move. I don't think Daniel wants to see you. At the mention of Daniel's name, the man's smirk widened. Ah, he said. So you do know him. He took a slow step forward. That makes things easier. Jake held up a hand, his stance firm. You take one more step, and we're going to have a problem. The man sighed, shaking his head. Relax, officer. We're just here to talk. No trouble. Jake's radio crackled. One of the backup officers spoke. We've got them covered from the side. Just say the word. Jake kept his expression unreadable. He knew these types, calm on the outside, dangerous underneath. If they weren't here for violence, they were here to intimidate. Either way, he wasn't letting them near Daniel or Margaret. I don't think Daniel has anything to say to you, Jake said. So why don't you turn that car around and leave? The man's smirk faded slightly. His eyes darkened. Look, officer, he said, his voice lower now. This isn't your problem. This is between us and him. You don't want to get in the middle of it. Jake didn't even flinch. That's where you're wrong, he said. Daniel is in my custody now. That means he is my problem. The man exhaled sharply through his nose, clearly annoyed. He glanced toward the cafe, as if considering his next move. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. All right, he said, raising his hand slightly. I see how it is. He took a step back. We'll go. Jake didn't relax. He knew this was too easy. The man turned to his two companions. Come on, boys. Slowly, they got back into the SUV. The engine revved. Jake watched carefully as the vehicle backed up, then pulled out of the parking lot. The moment it turned the corner and disappeared from sight, he grabbed his radio. They're leaving, but I don't trust it, he said. We need to move Daniel and Margaret now. Margaret peeked out from the cafe door, her face filled with worry. Are they gone? She asked. For now, Jake said. But they'll be back. Daniel swallowed hard. What do we do? Jake's eyes were sharp. We get you somewhere safe. And then we find a way to end this for good. Jake didn't waste any time. He turned to the officers standing nearby. We need to move them now, he said firmly. Margaret still looked shaken, her wrinkled hands gripping the cafe doorframe for support. Daniel, on the other hand, looked tense, his jaw clenched. He knew the men in the SUV weren't gone for good. One of the officers nodded. We have a safe house a few miles away. We can take them there until we figure this out. Margaret hesitated. A safe house? She asked. Is that really necessary? Jake softened his tone. Yes, Mom. Those men aren't going to stop looking for Daniel. We need to get you both somewhere they can't find you. Margaret looked at her grandson, worry in her eyes. I just want him to be safe. Daniel swallowed hard. I never wanted to bring this trouble to you, Grandma, he murmured. She reached out and squeezed his arm. You're my family. We face trouble together. Jake gave them both a reassuring nod. Let's go. A race against time. The officers moved quickly. One of the patrol cars was brought around to the back entrance of the cafe to avoid drawing attention. Jake led Margaret and Daniel outside, keeping a close eye on their surroundings. The town was quiet now. The black SUV was gone, but the tension in the air remained. Jake placed Margaret in the back seat of the patrol car first, helping her in gently. Daniel hesitated for a second before following. His hands were still cuffed, but Jake could tell he was too afraid to run. As soon as the doors shut, the officer in the driver's seat nodded. We'll take them straight to the safe house. Jake tapped the roof of the car. Drive carefully. We don't know if we're being watched. With that, the car pulled away, heading toward safety. Jake let out a slow breath. His gut told him this wasn't over yet. An unsettling discovery. Just as Jake was about to return to his own patrol car, something caught his eye. A small black object lying on the ground near where the SUV had been parked. Frowning, he walked over and crouched down. It was a cell phone. Jake picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The screen was cracked, but it was still on. It must have fallen from one of the men in the SUV. A notification popped up. A text message. Jake's pulse quickened as he read the words. Keep eyes on the cop. We take the kid when they're alone. His blood ran cold. This wasn't over. The men hadn't just been watching Daniel. They were watching him. The chase begins. Jake's mind raced. If these men were tracking Daniel, they could be following the patrol car right now. He grabbed his radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. We have a situation. I need a second unit to shadow the vehicle transporting Daniel and Margaret. Possible tail. The response came quickly. Copy that. Reynolds. Unit is en route. Jake didn't waste a second. He jumped into his own patrol car and started the engine. He wasn't going to let those men take Daniel. Not on his watch. His tires screeched as he pulled onto the road, heading toward the safe house. The real fight was just beginning. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped down the road, his eyes scanning every car around him. He had a bad feeling. Those men in the black SUV weren't done yet. They were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. He pressed his radio. Unit 12, do you have eyes on the patrol car carrying Daniel and Margaret? A voice crackled back. Affirmative, Officer Reynolds. We're 2 cars behind them. No signs of a tail yet. Jake's jaw tightened. He knew how criminals like this worked. They wouldn't make their move in the open. They would wait until the patrol car was alone, maybe when it stopped at a light, or turned down a quiet road. That's when they'd strike. And he wasn't going to let that happen. A sudden turn. Up ahead, the patrol car carrying Daniel and Margaret turned onto a less crowded road. It was the quickest route to the safe house, but it also meant fewer witnesses. Jake's heart pounded. Then, in his rearview mirror, he saw it. The black SUV. It was moving fast, weaving through traffic, heading in the same direction as the patrol car. Jake's pulse kicked into high gear. Unit 12, he advised. The black SUV is moving in. Stay close and be ready. Copy that, the officer replied. Jake pressed the gas, his car surging forward. The SUV was still a few cars away from Daniel and Margaret, but it was closing in. The attack begins. Then, everything happened at once. The SUV suddenly sped up, swerving into the next lane. It cut off a car, forcing it to brake hard. Then, it veered sharply toward the patrol car. Jake knew what was happening. They were going to ram it off the road. Look out, he shouted into the radio. But it was too late. The SUV slammed into the side of the patrol car. Tires screeched as the police car swerved wildly, struggling to stay on the road. Jake's heart pounded. Unit 12, move in. Move in now. The second police car sped forward, sirens blaring, but the SUV didn't stop. Instead, it rammed the patrol car again. This time, the police vehicle spun out, skidding onto the shoulder. Jake's stomach dropped. He couldn't see inside the car. Were Margaret and Daniel okay? There was no time to think. He had to act. Jake takes action. Jake slammed on the gas, his car roaring forward. He aimed straight for the black SUV, trying to cut it off before they could reach Daniel. The men inside must have realized they were out of time, because the passenger door of the SUV flew open. A man jumped out, running toward the crashed patrol car. Jake didn't hesitate. He threw his car into park and jumped out, gun drawn. Freeze, he shouted. The man didn't stop. He reached for the patrol car's back door, trying to yank it open. Jake fired a warning shot into the air. I said freeze. This time, the man hesitated. Behind Jake, the second police unit arrived. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn. The man's eyes darted around, realizing he was surrounded. Then suddenly, he dropped his hands and bolted toward the SUV. Jake wasn't about to let him escape. He sprinted forward, tackling the man to the ground just as he reached the car. They hit the pavement hard, struggling. The suspect threw a wild punch, but Jake blocked it and forced his arms behind his back. You're not going anywhere, Jake growled. An officer rushed over, snapping cuffs onto the man's wrists. The driver of the SUV saw what was happening and peeled out, tires screeching as he sped away. Jake cursed under his breath. They had caught one, but the others were still loose. Margaret and Daniel's fate. Jake pushed himself up and ran toward the crashed patrol car. Are you guys okay? He called out. The officer in the driver's seat gave a weak nod. He was dazed but conscious. Jake yanked open the back door. Margaret was holding onto Daniel tightly, her face pale with fear. Daniel looked up, his breathing heavy. I thought they had us, he whispered. Jake exhaled in relief. Not today, he said. You're safe now. But deep inside, he knew the fight wasn't over yet. The rest of the men were still out there. and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Jake knew they weren't safe yet. The black SUV had gotten away, and the men who wanted Daniel wouldn't stop until they had him. But now they had an advantage. They had caught one of the criminals. 2 officers dragged the captured man toward a patrol car. He struggled, but Jake had already seen the fear in his eyes. He knew they had him. Jake stepped forward. "Your friends left you behind. That means you've got 2 choices. You help us, or you take the fall alone." The man clenched his jaw, looking away. "I don't know anything." Jake smirked. "You sure?" "Because I think the guys in the SUV will make sure you don't talk. And you know what that means." The man swallowed hard. He looked at the officers, then at the road where the SUV had disappeared. After a long pause, he sighed. "All right," he muttered. "They're going to an old warehouse outside town. That's where they plan to take the kid." Jake exchanged a look with his team. This was their chance to end it. A dangerous plan. Back at the station, Margaret and Daniel were taken to a secure room. An officer brought Margaret a cup of tea, but she barely touched it. She was too worried about Daniel. "I should have done more," Daniel whispered. "This is all my fault." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You made a mistake, but you're fixing it. That's what matters." Jake walked in, his face serious. "We know where they are," he said. "We're going after them." Daniel's eyes widened. "You're going there, but they're dangerous." Jake smiled slightly. "So are we." Margaret's voice trembled. "Be careful, Officer Reynolds." Jake nodded. "We'll end this tonight." The final confrontation. The warehouse was dark and quiet. Jake and his team parked their cars a few blocks away, approaching on foot. Jake gave a silent signal. 2 officers moved toward the back while he and another approached the front. Through a crack in the warehouse door, Jake saw them. 2 men pacing inside, talking, and in the middle of the room, stacks of money sat on a table. Jake pressed his radio. "We have eyes on them. Moving in." Slowly, he pushed the door open. The men inside barely had time to react before Jake shouted, "Police! Hands up!" One of them reached for a gun, but an officer fired a warning shot into the air. "Drop it." The man hesitated, then threw the gun down, raising his hands. The other man cursed and tried to run, but officers were already blocking the exits. In seconds, it was over. Handcuffs clicked into place. The criminals had nowhere left to run. Jake stood over the table, staring at the stolen money. He shook his head. All this, and it still wasn't worth it. A new beginning. The next morning, Daniel sat in the police station, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He had agreed to cooperate, to testify against the men who had chased him. Jake sat across from him. "You've got a second chance, Daniel. Use it wisely." Daniel nodded. "I will. No more running." Margaret hugged him tightly. "That's my boy." Jake smiled. The case was closed. Daniel was safe, and for the first time in a long time, things felt right. As he walked toward his car, the sun rising in the distance, he took a deep breath. It had been a long night, but justice had won.